Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the Resource Platform webinar on physical versus virtual PPAs and how to choose. My name is Bruce Douglas. I'm the Deputy CEO of SolarPower Europe and the coordinator of the Resource Platform. So in today's webinar, we have three leading experts in the field. I'll introduce them during the webinar. Before I do so, I'll give a brief introduction to Resource and the activities we undertake, and also a summary of the market situation for PPAs in Europe. So firstly, this slide you see shows the Resource event, which takes place next week in Amsterdam from the 20th to the 21st of November. The aim of the event is to connect renewable energy buyers and sellers, raise awareness and educate all stakeholders in corporate sourcing. You see here the list of topics that are being covered in the conference and the partners involved. So the Resource Platform itself is made up of the four associations: SolarPower Europe, Wind Europe on the supply side, RE100, part of the climate group, on the buy side, and WBCSD, who represent both sides. The steering committee of the Resource Platform includes four supply side companies, so NL, NG, Iberdrola, and RES, and then many of the largest corporates active in European corporate sourcing, including one of the speakers today, Microsoft. We have a number of association partners as well, representing relevant stakeholders within Europe. And there you see, including CEFEC, the European Chemical Industry Association, Euroelectric representing the utilities, and REX, Renewable Energy Certificates. All data provided to Resources provided by Bloomberg, is our Bloomberg New Energy Finance, who is our data partner. So the objectives of the platform are very clear. First, and primarily to influence decision makers, both at EU and national level, to accelerate corporate sourcing. Secondly, to raise awareness and educate all stakeholders, obviously policymakers, but also suppliers, and most importantly, buyers, so especially buyers who are new to corporate sourcing. And finally, to provide business opportunities, firstly through events and activities to connect the two sides, buyers and suppliers, but also to facilitate transactions. The Resource Platform is working hard to make transactions easier, simpler, and cheaper. And our motto is to move buyers from 100 to 100,000, meaning we want to increase the number of active corporate buyers in Europe from the current 100 or 200 active buyers to the 100,000, which means widening to small and medium-sized companies and also to the energy-intensive sector. So where are we in PPAs globally? This Bloomberg New Energy Finance graph shows year-to-date PPA volumes globally and by region. So what you see is the Americas, primarily the United States, leading by some margin with 5.6 gigawatts of PPAs signed this year. Europe, the EMEA region, 1.9 gigawatts, and APAC, 1.3. So Europe is quite far behind the US in terms of volumes of PPAs. In terms of the active corporates, you see there the list of leading corporates active in the space, and the colors, yellow being solar, blue being wind. And so Facebook, AT&T, Norsk Hydro, Alcoa Corp, Microsoft, and so on. In terms of the European PPA status, you see again the year-to-date figures with 1.9 gigawatts of annual installations, bringing the cumulative up to about 6 gigawatts of PPAs having currently been signed so far. What you also see is that wind is the dominant technology in terms of PPAs at the moment. But please note that this graph only covers PPAs, and that's off-site PPAs. on-site solar is not registered in this graph, which an approximate estimate for year to date for this year is also about 2 gigawatts. So there's about 2 gigawatts of solar on-site commercial industrial rooftop and about 2 gigawatts of wind PPAs. This graph shows the off-taker by type, by sector in Europe. Clearly manufacturing there having a large portion of them. This is large energy intensive, such as Norsk Hydro signing large wind PPAs, having a big effect here, but other sectors also being represented. And what we're seeing generally is a trend towards more and more sectors being involved, moving from the IT sector into retail, energy intensives and beyond. And in Europe, by country, out of the 1.9 gigawatts, what's clear is it's restricted just to a small number of countries. Last year in 2017, it was really 3 countries. This year it's moved to 4 countries, but still very restricted to the Nordics. And this is indicative of the legislation and the constraints that puts on the ability for the market to uptake corporate sourcing. It's another issue where Resource Platform is working very hard to unlock this opportunity and mirror what's happening in the Nordics in the other countries around Europe. What's also interesting to know is that the vast majority of PPAs being signed in Europe are physical PPAs. That's the topic for today's webinar, and we'll be discussing, first of all, what is the difference between the physical PPA and the virtual PPA, but also why is there significant uptake of physical PPAs in Europe, whereas in the United States it's more the virtual PPAs. And finally, a graph showing the forecast going forward. And this graph only shows the energy, the electricity demand of European domiciled RE100 companies. So it's a small number of companies, 30 or 40 companies who are European headquartered. This is their annual electricity demand going forward. And if you take their commitment to go to 100% renewable electricity and forecast it forward, for them to meet that ambition by 2030 would mean the total annual electricity demand of 70 terawatt hours in 2030. That's an enormous amount of power, approximately equivalent to the annual electricity consumption of Belgium. And that white part there is the gap that needs to be filled by renewables. Currently, as you see in 2017, a large portion of the corporate sourcing is done through certificate purchases. And what we'll see is that going more and more towards new build renewables, wind, solar, and other renewables to fill up that shortfall of the 70 terawatt hours. So I'll stop there. What we'll do now is pass to our 3 experts to give us more detail about the PPAs and specifically the difference between the physical PPAs, which are otherwise called sleeved back-to-back PPAs, or virtual PPAs, otherwise can be called synthetic or financial PPAs. So first, we'll take questions after our first presenter. First is Phil Dominy, the director of Ernst & Young. I could probably say, Phil, that you are one of the world's leading experts in corporate sourcing and PPAs specifically. I'll pass over to you, Phil, to give us an introduction to physical and virtual PPAs. Thanks, Phil.
Thanks a lot, Bruce. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to be with you. I'm a director in the corporate finance energy team here in London. Been working on corporate PPAs and strategies for 10 years now. Had my 10-year birthday here at EY just a few weeks ago, so quite a milestone for me. But yeah, it's good to be able to present to you today. My topic is what to consider when beginning the PPA journey. So sort of using that analogy, I'll sort of progress through this slide show. Next slide, please. And next one. Great. Okay. So as I say, building on that analogy of a journey, I think imagine we've got a number of corporates dialed in to this call, and you've got some sort of long-term ambitions about where you want to go, your sort of destination in terms of renewables for your company. And just establishing that goal is a major first step for a number of corporates. You have to obviously discuss it amongst a number of different functions within your company, getting everyone sort of on board with the concept. It may be an RE100 target, obviously a sort of initiative that's gained a lot of traction in the market recently. Or it may be a carbon reduction target, or it may be some combination of both those. But ideally, it'll be some specific target by some specific date. And like most things in life, it's not one size fits all. It'll vary depending on your sector, depending on your maturity, your footprint across the globe. Many different factors will affect what is an appropriate target for you to aim at. And also, in effect, one size doesn't fit all. It's going to be a portfolio of options that are going to get you from A to B. It's just not one mode of transport, to use that analogy, but a number of different modes to reach your destination. Next slide. And as you start out on your journey, there are a number of questions that typically will be sort of bubbling around in your mind. If we sort of start at 12 o'clock, as it were. So what is your corporate's forecast consumption per country? That is obviously a key driver. Just to use a sort of Pareto 80-20 rule, probably you'll get 80% of the way through to your target through maybe just 20% of your countries that you're located in. So what are the biggest countries in terms of your operational footprint? Scope 2, we're talking in that sense, sort of procured electricity in this context. So but that's not obviously the only factor. Within that consumption in a particular country, some of it may be outside of your control. It may be controlled and paid by a landlord, or it may be some other way that you have not got access to pay the bill. So deciding that you want to move to a PPA, for example, would certainly constrain that. So I've just done a big analysis with the global corporate. We looked right across their operational footprint, 67 countries, and actually about 67%, coincidentally, of their footprint was controllable. They were paying the bill, but the remaining 33% was landlord controlled. So that really restricts what you can do in terms of options. So that's certainly something that needs to be borne in mind. And as you look to move premises and go to new sites, that is maybe an area to negotiate, in terms of the lease for the next site, that you do have visibility of your electricity bill. If you're going down the off-site PPA route, which I imagine a number of you are, just from the sort of sheer scale that can be achieved, there are certain countries where it just isn't possible yet. Many of the regulated countries, it's just not on the menu, as it were. And so, you need to consider what countries is it possible to do PPAs, both physical or financial. So that's certainly a factor which will drive your journey. Also, at the start of the journey, you need to get comfortable with what technologies are preferred. Is it the sort of traditional onshore wind and solar PV, or are you a very big corporate and maybe could consider offshore wind? Would you consider biomass, or even other technologies like energy from waste or small hydro? Certainly within the group of stakeholders that you are part of, you'd need to get comfortable with that. And then, well, what projects are there available? So you're in all these countries, you've worked out your land, what part of your bill you can pay. You decide what technologies you're interested in and prefer, but what projects are there out there? What's the project pipeline looking like? Are there a lot of new build projects available, waiting for a PPA? Are there some existing projects? And around that is all this sort of discussion around additionality. Do you just want to bring new projects online, or are you comfortable with contracting with an existing project? So new or old, and how many projects, and what size of the projects are they suitable for your appetite? And finally, or not finally actually, but penultimately, what do the economics look like in that particular country? What are the business as usual prices for wholesale, for example? Is it a high wholesale market where renewables will be more competitive, or is it a low wholesale market? Are PPA prices high or low? It's that relative difference between the PPA price and the wholesale market that's critical. And also, if you're looking at a sleeving or a physical PPA, what are the transmission, distribution, balancing costs likely to be? But in the center of all this, when you start your journey, really, really critically, is have you got all the stakeholders committed to your goal? And sometimes, very painfully, I've been down this process, and I've sort of worked with corporates, and they've assured me, they've reached out to all the relevant stakeholders. Sometimes late in the day, a stakeholder will pop up that for some reason or another is not in favor, and getting people on board late in the day is really tough. So really get aligned at the beginning as early as you can, and that should make a big difference as you set out on your journey. Next slide, please. So in terms of getting from A to B, what routes and options do you have? I mean, I've talked about PPAs quite a lot already, but that's not the only option, as you already seen and heard. First and foremost, really is energy efficiency. I'm sure you're aware that to reduce your energy use is by far where you should start, and I'm sure a lot of the corporates on this call are on top of that and making great progress. But it's the classic sort of law of diminishing returns. It gets some of the quick wins are fairly quick, but then it gets harder and harder as you get to the more difficult initiatives and the more expensive and longer payback initiatives. So ultimately, at some point, you'll also be looking at generation in terms of on-site. Some corporates that's maybe not relevant. I work with a lot of corporates that have, say, high-rise office blocks in the center of big cities. The roof space they have, for example, for PV is negligible. There's a lot of plant equipment up there and so forth, and it's just not an option. However, you might have lots of distribution centers or data centers with good flat roofs or land adjacent. So on-site generation, which I'd also include private wire, is definitely an option that you can consider. There's very sort of strong brand connections there. It's more visible. People sort of really understand it, they get it, and there's certainly can be some good financial savings. I think that the one challenge is that it often the scale, even when you've got good sort of roof space and adjacent land, is still not large enough for many corporates' requirements. So ultimately, many corporates are considering at the moment off-site PPAs. We've seen the growth of off-site PPAs from Bruce's charts earlier. And that growth, I'm sure, will jump up across the pond in even greater measure in the coming years. And I think in terms of financial and sort of carbon or sustainability and brand, I think it's a sort of win-win-win, really. Certainly, there are some significant financial savings for a number of markets. Again, you need to sort of pick your market. There'll be as I say, lower priced wholesale markets where maybe it's more challenging, and there'll be higher priced markets. There'll be markets with lower priced PPAs than others. So, every market is different in that respect. But the other provision, obviously, from a PPA is potentially price security. Depends a bit on what structure PPA you take, but you can get increased price stability than just floating on the market. Although having said that, some corporates will want to float on the market between maybe a sort of cap and floor, and that pricing structure is also popular amongst some sectors. It's a very much a sort of large scale and long-term solution, and it will provide, you know, significant carbon reduction. And in terms of brand, I think as time goes by, we're seeing more and more corporates and general public really understanding what PPAs are all about. In terms of tariffs and certificates, definitely that there's a place for them, absolutely. You know, it's quite sort of, it would be quite risky to sort of PPA to the hilt, as it were, and so these offer some flexibility above maybe your sort of PPA volumes, but maybe not quite the same sort of level of reputational benefits as maybe on-site or off-site PPAs potentially. And carbon offsetting certainly was a very popular method to reduce carbon, but it certainly is becoming less so recently. But having said that, there are still you know, there are good reasons to use carbon offsetting, particularly say for heat emissions, which can't be dealt with through electricity. Next slide, please. So in terms of the structures, I mean, Feifei's going to do a bit more on structures in a moment when I hand on to her, but just to sort of give you a feel for the two major structures, sort of sleeved and virtual, it doesn't make it any easier that they've all got different names for the same thing. So sleeved you may hear as physical or even back-to-back, and that, as we've heard earlier from Bruce, is the dominant structure in Europe. The corporate sat right in the middle, in effect, has a PPA with the project, and REGOs sort of flow the other way, or GEOs or RECs, whichever market you're in. And the wholesale energy sort of goes on to the through a utility, sleeving utility, and that comes in through sleeving PPA. And that will typically complement the retail supply agreement power, so it sort of tops up that side of things. There are many positives and potential downsides as well. There are obviously direct association with the generating asset, buying from a specific project. You can have different types of structures. You can have the floating structure with a floor and ceiling, typically at a discount to market, I mentioned earlier, or a fixed price, often index linked. And generally the accounting treatment of that is more straightforward. Potential downsides, it can be seen as complex. There are sort of two back-to-back PPA range agreements. So you need to make sure as a corporate you're not exposed in the middle of those two. Also, if you are sort of sleeving the power, your utility will need to obviously charge for that, but we'll look at another way that can be done a bit later. And then the balanced power will also, the power you actually get through will depend on what's produced. So in effect, you have what's called volume risk. Moving on to the virtual PPA. Next slide, please. Sorry, I can't. There we go. Virtual or synthetic. Oh, it's gone back. Or synthetic or financial, the dominant structure in the US, and particularly that's around this CFD structure between the corporate and the project. So it's potentially a simpler structure with the project just selling onto the sort of wholesale market or through a sort of PPA, utility type PPA. But the main contract for difference is between the corporate and the project, and is difference basically between the PPA price that's struck, what's agreed, and whichever wholesale energy index is being used to mark against. The corporate can continue to buy the retail its power through its retail supply, so there is much more flexibility in that respect for the corporate. It can have it can carry on with its retail supply agreement sort of life cycles, 2-3 years, whatever that is for yourselves. And the CFD can sit alongside that. So it is a simpler structure. There isn't a balancing responsibility because you're not buying the physical power. But it can, the deltas in the contract for difference can be volatile, and Vanessa from Microsoft will talk a bit about that and minimizing that risk a bit later. I suppose one of the other challenges is around accounting treatment can be more difficult, as it's considered a financial instrument. So yeah, there are good sides and less good sides for the virtual PPA. I'm sure Feifei will mention a couple other things in a moment. Before I finish off, just to talk about briefly a sort of variant of the sleeved PPA that's coming on the market. We're seeing it more, certainly in the UK and I imagine in Europe as well. So in a typical sleeve PPA, the sleeving supplier does everything. If you can imagine, you're a sort of, I don't know, so you're a you've got a bow and arrow and you're running along, and also a target you're firing at is also running along, maybe in a different direction. It's like two variables, and the chance of hitting that target it would be challenging. I think using that analogy with intermittent renewable output, which is varying, and obviously variable corporate demand, the sleeving supplier has quite a challenge there to match both of those together. I think some of the earlier PPAs we did have sleeve PPAs of the full generator PPA length, so typically 15 years, but more often recently, sleevers have been a bit wary about providing a sleeve PPA beyond 3 years just because of unknown quantity around price cannibalization, what happens when there's excessive renewables on the grid and prices depress. So typically we've had this exposure of a renewable PPA of 15 years and a sleeving PPA of 3 years, and sleeving prices as a sort of unknown quantity beyond that term. Now, one thing that's sort of stepped in recently, we're seeing more and more aggregators and utilities or balancing responsible parties coming in and basically sitting on top of that agreement, that the generator PPA between the corporate and the generator, and converting that intermittent renewable output into a firm baseload block. So that's a sort of easy chunk of power that can be sort of assimilated into the corporate's retail supply. So it sort of gets away from a lot of the unknown quantities around balancing of that. I mean, clearly there's a sort of cost to do that, but sleeving, the sleeving role of the utility will be less. It just has to take that blocked power. So I think that's certainly an area that we're seeing coming in, and some of the providers for that give a long term. They give 5, 10, possibly more in terms of years of giving that assurance. And typically we'll see reconciliation of those volumes to actual volumes, maybe annually. But yeah, that's certainly an area that I think we'll see increasingly in terms of sleeve PPA structures. And I think that's probably enough for me. I hand it over back to Bruce or to Feifei. I'm not sure which, but we can take any questions later, I believe.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Phil, and for the interesting presentation. We will actually take a quick question now. So for the audience, please note that you can ask questions using the panel. Just please type your question into there, and I can see that. We already have one question for you, Phil. You mentioned, and so did I, that physical sleeve PPAs are more common in Europe, financial virtual more common in the US. The question is, why is that? You started to mention that a little bit, but you know, if it is simpler to do virtual PPAs, why are they not being done in Europe? And maybe just a word on how can we accelerate that in Europe to unlock more demand. Keep your answer quite brief because of the timing, but welcome your response.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the one major reason I would give is that in the US, it's quite a disaggregated market. There are lots of different, what we call RTOs, regional transmission organization areas across the country, lots of different sort of regional networks. And as a result, if you're a corporate in the US and you've got consumption across many of these different networks, a virtual PPA is a great way to aggregate those into, you know, a single project or two, which gains economies of scale. But to do that, you can't sort of in effect sleeve or do a physical PPA across multiple different networks. It's just not feasible. So the virtual PPA allows you to aggregate into, as I say, a few projects in maybe a different region to where you're consuming. I mean, that does lead to potential risk if the markets are not tightly correlated. You get what's called basis risk. So there's benefits, but there's also downsides. I mean, I think in terms of Europe, I think most of the PPAs to date have been within the same sort of grid network, be it in the Nordics or in Netherlands or UK. They've been within one sort of grid, and so you would be sleeving, you'd be doing physical PPA. We may see in Europe a similar sort of concept to the US, where corporates aggregate onto one single project or a couple of projects in one particular country, and with the EU, with sort of geos valid across different countries within the EU, then that could work. But again, it potentially opens up corporates to basis risk between the power markets in different countries. So we may see it for economies of scale sort of benefits, but there are associated risks with that as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Phil. We've got a couple of other questions popped up just now, but in the interest of time, we'll move on. If we've got time at the end, I may come back to you, Phil, on that. Otherwise, I can see who's asking the question. We'll try and connect you after the call, after the webinar. Okay? So now,
thank you.
Yep, thanks very much. So now we move on to our next presenter. So it's Feifei Peng. She's commercial manager at RES, and she's going to build on what Phil said and talk about the business case for physical and virtual PPAs. Okay, so we hand over control to you now, Feifei, and look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. So yes, my name is Feifei. I've been at RES and have about 10 years experience in the renewable industry. So here I would like to start my presentation with a couple of words on RES. So RES is a company of 35-year history in the renewable industry. Our sister company, Robert McAlpine, is an engineering and construction company of more than 150 years history. What we are doing here, our vision is to create a future where everybody has access to affordable, low carbon energy. Can we move on to next page, please? Yes, and as a company, we are present in 10 different countries, and we have about 2,000 colleagues worldwide. One number that's not present in this page, which is present in the next page, is as Bruce discussed, there are worldwide 8.7 gigawatt and counting of PPA being signed. RES has signed more than 1 gigawatt, including the first corporate PPA in Australia. So I would like to briefly discuss about physical PPA and virtual PPA. So in terms of physical PPA, there are two different types. There are on-site physical PPA and off-sites. Those physical PPA are previously dominated by utility power market maker. And now we are seeing more and more corporates, especially in Europe, are very active. And there are pros and cons for each on-site or off-site solution. On-site, of course, you can buy the actual power, and there is no third-party transmission. Of course, there are downsides to it, which is, well, definitely we are limited by the scale due to the siting constraint, and for off-site, is easier because we can achieve economy of scale, although we are still limited by sites in the same grid region. So in terms of virtual PPA, what are they? They are more of a financial instrument, renewable energy project, and the buyer, they do not need to be in the same grid region. So they are quite appealing to buyers that have multiple load centers. And it gives the buyer more choices over projects. So in principle, you should be able to achieve lower cost, economy of scale, and also be able to maintain your existing electricity supply contracts. So in terms of structure, virtual PPA should be easy. And next, I would like to spend some time on the topics for you to consider as corporate buyers. Why? Because we are, as RES, we are present in 10 different countries worldwide, and we have ongoing discussions with lots of different corporate buyers. And what we would like to do is to share our experience. As a few at EY just mentioned, there is no one-size-fits-all solution for everybody. And as if you have participated in the webinar last week, you would probably have already heard from Sonia at SolarPower. Her presentation last week mentioned, I think there's more than a dozen corporate renewable sourcing solution and corporate PPA being physical or virtual is only just part of the solution. So I think in terms of the topics for you to consider, it's very important that you understand your need and also the market specifics. As a large multinational company, for example, you may have a central energy procurement team, but you have operations in different countries, and different countries have different specifics, the local realities, as I call it. You may start with countries that has no longer subsidies, which would make corporate PPA make sense. But actually the reality is sometimes in these countries, corporate PPA may not make sense if it's not structured well, or if compared to what investors are looking for, especially in countries like, for example, in the UK, where established institutional investors are already comfortable with investing in projects that's on a merchant-only basis. So having a PPA only makes sense when it's at the right price and is well structured. And similarly, vice versa, for countries where there is already subsidy regime, it does not mean that PPA will not make sense. For example, in France, yes, there is subsidy in place, and is quite lucrative. And I don't think any corporate would like to buy renewable power at this subsidy price. But it's worth knowing that for projects, for example, solar project larger than 30 megawatts, those projects will not be able to be eligible to participate in public tender. So it is important route to market for such projects. So the market specifics are very important, and really as a corporate, you may not, and we don't expect you to understand it. So come and talk to developers like us. another area I would like to mention is as corporate, you need to understand your needs. Whether or not you need additionality, and actually on additionality, can you be flexible? For example, would you consider a repowered project as additional? What's your load? That's important. It leads to the project size, and why project size are important is if projects are very large, that means debt is generally needed, and that means a PPA would definitely help in terms of project finance. And your need also include going back to your corporate renewable energy sourcing plan. You can do a PPA or an investment or equity investment, and also whether or not virtual or physical PPA makes sense to you. And another topic is very important, as Phil at EY just mentioned. We need to make sure all stakeholders are involved from an early stage, and accounting treatment of a virtual PPA or physical PPA are very important. So make sure your CFO is on board. And lastly, I would like to highlight the importance of choosing the right partner for you, and what exactly you are asking. Do you really is that your wish list or your must-have? For example, we have unfortunately have to turn down some corporate PPA opportunity because the buyer would like termination for convenience. That's just not acceptable from the institutional debt provider's point of view. The reps and warranties that you are asking, the credit support, all of those may add cost to the project in terms of debt or equity, and those will bring the PPA price up, and ultimately you'll be the one picking up the bill. So find out whether or not you really need what you are asking. And in terms of choosing your developers well, also whether or not they are able to deliver what you need on time according to the agreed timetable, and what are the consequences if they do not deliver. And in terms of choosing your partner, do they have the experience already? In terms of, for example, for RES, we have local development team, and also established a relationship with corporates. And our reputation and experience, actually, I was just off the phone with one of the very large international buyers who actually just mentioned to me they view RES's EPC experience as a plus, because we can deliver things as we always have delivered. So that's I think very important for you as a corporate buyer. And I could we go on to the next page? Yes. So that's the end of my presentation. I'll hand over to you, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Feifei. So we do have just 1 minute for questions. You mentioned the accountancy treatment. There's one very specific question here. I mean, for you, maybe Phil also, but if you keep your answer brief, so we have time for Vanessa. We just have 15 minutes left of the webinar. But the question is, what are the pros and cons of financial versus physical PPAs with regard to the IFRS 9 and IFRS 16? Can you answer that? Or if not, then maybe I go to Phil.
That's a very good question. So in terms of virtual PPA or physical PPA, depending on how is worded, our understanding is that generally corporate CFO would generally prefer PPAs to be off balance sheet. because a PPA is not your core business. You don't want your financial ratios to be affected by signing up to a PPA or by signing up to a renewable energy target. So our experience is very much depending on how you word, how you structure your PPA and how it's worded legally. It can be off balance sheet item. So come to talk to us and we can figure out a solution for you.
Okay, very good. Okay, so I won't come back to you, Phil. I'm going to move on to the next presenter. So now we have Vanessa Miler-Fels. She's the Renewable Energy and Sustainability Strategy Manager at Microsoft. So Vanessa, thanks very much for joining us. And you'll go into more details on the benefits and risks of physical versus virtual PPAs and from Microsoft's experience. Thank you. I'll just hand over to you now.
Thank you, Bruce. Thanks for the invitation to join this webinar. So I'm Vanessa Miler-Fels, and I work on greening the energy Microsoft Cloud consumes. So I give Microsoft's perspective on and view on the preference for virtual power purchases agreements. So I don't know if I can't see the presentation here. So if you can move to the first slide. Yeah, great. Next slide, please. So the world increasingly races to a future based on cloud computing. There's a host of new and important public issues that are emerging. And one of these issues that all of my previous panelists have mentioned involve the energy and sustainability practices of the data centers that power the cloud. And so Microsoft has spent considerable efforts thinking about our role in the energy supply chain. And I really want to share with this webinar kind of some of the progress that we've made, the challenges that we've met, and how we've addressed some of them, particularly some of the challenges that come with virtual PPA, some of the risks that we have to mitigate, and that we've mitigated with proxy revenue swaps or volume firming agreements. Next slide, please. So in a snapshot, Microsoft commitment to sustainability has been a journey. We started in 2012 being carbon neutral and have set incremental targets for reaching 50% of the energy use of our data centers from wind power and hydropower sources by 2018, a target that we've met, and now we're on to meet our next target, which is 60% by 2020, continuing towards a goal of 100% renewable energy. Next slide, please. From an energy standpoint, there are three core areas Microsoft is focused on, and I'll focus on two today. So generating clean energy for operations, so signing corporate PPAs or signing ways to procure renewables, enabling the next generation of energy technology, and I won't dive into that one today, and bringing new solutions to market. So there's different ways through new technology and business models, also by innovating in the way we interact with utilities and grid operators, or, and I will more insist on that one today, creating new products that can mitigate the risks that are associated with sourcing renewables, and that can, we think, contribute to enabling the grid to continue to transition to a low carbon future and really get to your 100 corporate buyers to 100,000 corporate buyers, as you mentioned, Bruce. So next slide. What is a virtual or financial PPA? I think both Phil and Feifei did a very good job at presenting kind of the mechanics, so I will go pretty quick on the next few slides. But a virtual PPA is a financial arrangement between a renewable electricity generator, so I will call that the seller, and a customer, the buyer or the offtaker, that will enable both parties to kind of hedge, and we can come back to that kind of edge against electricity market price volatility. So virtual PPA offers buyers the cost predictability for the electricity use and enables them to promote growth in the renewable energy sector, what we call additionality, by offering sellers the long-term contracts and the predictable revenues that are critical for them to get project financing and investment. Financial PPAs are an innovative and useful procurement option, particularly in regulated electricity markets. And so I think this is one of the elements that explained why virtual PPA are particularly strong in the US, as Phil mentioned, because there are a number of regulated electricity markets that do not permit physical PPA. But beyond regulated markets, and that would be particularly applicable for Europe, virtual PPAs can be attractive instruments because they provide flexibility to the buyer. And there's kind of two core flexibility that were both mentioned by Phil and Feifei: flexibility to source renewable from one project when the load of the buyer is scattered across multiple geographies. For example, think of a retailer that has maybe load across many countries in Europe, and flexibility to source for a growing load profile. And the latter is particularly important for Microsoft. The cloud is growing, and we want to continue to source renewable energy for that growth. Two factors that are generally critical for virtual PPA to be available. First, virtual PPA require market liquidity. So the seller will need to be able to sell its power directly into the grid. And that's the case in a RTO and ISO region that Phil mentioned, but not necessarily so in a vertically integrated market where a single entity will be responsible for generation, transmission, and distribution of electricity. So this is, for some markets in Asia, virtual PPA are still not an option. Second, virtual PPA require a transparent market, and the economics of a PPA hinge on the difference between the floating market price and what Phil called the strike price, the virtual PPA price. And the benefit there is RTO and ISO regions in the US, for example, and in Europe. Otherwise, there's a uniform, transparent price, which varies, of course, based on time and location. But the floating market price cannot be manipulated by the developer, creating kind of a reliable underlier for the virtual PPA financial settlement. So I listed kind of some of the main benefits of the virtual PPA here, but we've touched upon a few of them. Economies of scale, renewable resource optimization. The project can be developed where the resource is best, rather than where the load necessarily is. And one key element, and we can go to the next slide, is that when you decide to do a virtual PPA, your electricity supply contract is untouched. So unlike the physical PPA, a virtual PPA is a financial contract rather than a contract for power. There is no physical delivery of power from the seller to the customer. And because there is no energy that actually changes end, the virtual PPA offtaker does not need to make any changes to how it purchases the electricity that's required for its operation, which is quite attractive for Microsoft to kind of really decouple the operations and the procurement of renewable energy. Go to next slide. So this simple way it works, and we'll go very quickly on these few slides because I think Feifei and Phil did that already, but the customer enters into a long-term fixed price arrangement. Go to next slide. Under this long-term fixed price arrangement, the customer pays or receives the net difference in price per kilowatt hour between the power it pulls from the grid and the price that generator receives from the grid at the interconnection point. Next slide. And the price that the generator receives, so at the interconnection point, I said that. The seller generates and liquidates the project energy at the market pricing. So it can, there can be upside and downsides for the corporate offtaker, and that's really one of the main risks and where the hedge efficacy of the deal needs to be questioned, and we'll get into that in my second part of the presentation. One element, so next slide, please. One physical aspect of the synthetic PPA is the GOOs or the RECs or the REGOs. The corporate will usually need the green certificate, so that's one thing that's being physically delivered from the buyer to the seller, even though it's called a purely financial transaction. So now we're going to look at how risks are allocated between the seller and the buyer under a virtual PPA, and you can go to the next slide. So when a seller builds a project, there's a few risks that you're most of them familiar with: resource risk, operational risk, price risk, and shape risk. Resource risk is how much and when will the facility produce, kind of a time of day consideration. Operational risk is any risk that's linked to operating and maintaining the facility over its full life. Price risk is what revenue will the seller get from the wholesale power market. And shape risk, this one is a bit trickier. It's also called in Europe sometimes cannibalization risk. And it's really the relationship between the time of day of production and the market price. So this is a very critical risk, and a risk that's difficult to model for corporates. And that's really the one that we try to address by signing the PPA firming swap that we announced a few weeks ago. So solar and wind energy are non-dispatchable, and they're weather-driven. As we all know, when the sun shines, all the solar farms will be coming online, and they will all be producing at the same time. Same for the wind. And this clustering kind of production will depress the market clearing price. So that's how it cannibalizes renewables, kind of cannibalizes itself. And consequently, to determine the revenue that a solar or wind project will earn, it's not enough to know the total volume produced and the average market price. What's important is when the power is produced. That matters pretty much as the rest. You can go to next slide, please. So when signing a virtual PPA, the seller will allocate both price risk and shape risk to the buyer. And the problem is, as market penetration of renewables grows, that shape risk or cannibalization risk becomes more and more challenging for corporates to manage. You can go to next slide. And so unlike a virtual PPA or a fixed kind of volume swap, the proxy revenue swap will hedge both the volume and the shape risk in addition to the price risk. So these risk transfer products that we've implemented with partners, Alliance, Risk Transfer, and Resurety and Nefila in the US, are new product offerings that I think will really enable to mitigate risks that corporates do not want to take and are maybe sometimes limiting corporates' interest. I will cut off here because I see I only have 2 minutes left, and I'm sure there'll be questions, but I could go on and on on this proxy revenue swap.
Okay, thanks a lot, Vanessa. In fact, there's no specific questions for you, but given the timing, we do need to end. So thanks for that. But what I will do is just come to you and ask for your takeaway, your single takeaway from the presentations we've had and your experience of virtual PPA specifically, and what you would say to corporates, new entrants of whatever size, who are entering the space and looking to source renewables. What would be your message to them, first of all, and secondly, linked to that, a message to them in terms of why they should consider virtual PPAs, and elaborating a bit on what you said in the first few slides, and secondly, to the policy issue legislation and what could facilitate more virtual PPAs happening in Europe.
Yeah, so in your first point, I think both Phil and Feifei have addressed it. It's really knowing what you want and knowing kind of the 10 plus avenues to source renewables. PPAs are not the only way, and they're certainly not the simplest way. They present some interesting benefits which are related to hedging and scale. But one way is also green tariffs or procuring directly from your supplier. So depending what's your size and what's your ambition, I think the first step is really to assess that and make sure that you just don't fall into kind of the PPA bucket, because it's just kind of right now it's where most innovations are, and hopefully that will populate into other aspects of corporate sourcing. And then On your second question, more related to policy in Europe and why it's why physical PPA are still kind of the trend. I think it doesn't necessarily have to do with policy. The policy is I mean, there's as many kind of limitation on physical as in financial, but it's more education of the different parties and bringing the right stakeholders around the table. So bringing, for example, more reinsurers around the table to offer these types of products so that the risks that are associated with financial PPA will be available for more customers.
Very good, very good. Okay, and there is a question just popped up in the last minute. So the question is, how does a virtual PPA ensure additionality? Vanessa, can you answer that?
Sure. So the same way a physical PPA works, when signing a financial PPA, we're providing financial certainty to the seller, which enables them to build the project and feed the grid with new megawatt hours of renewable energy that otherwise would not have been added to the grid. So that's where the additionality is. We cannot anyway, I don't think any of us can track the little physical electron with a green tag from one facility to the other. And one of the pictures that we had right before was one of our facilities in the Netherlands. And even though it's a physical PPA, its physical location is so close to our data center that you could argue that pretty much the wind facility that's located behind our data center is feeding our data center because of the grid efficiency. So yeah, it's about adding renewable to the grid.
Okay, thanks a lot, Vanessa, and thanks a lot for your time showing us Microsoft's leadership in the space. And for the audience, Vanessa is actually speaking at the event next week in Amsterdam, next Tuesday afternoon. So we'll see much more there. We'll share the slides with the audience after the webinar. Please do consider coming to the event next week to meet with our speakers. Phil, myself will also be there at the event. And be aware that it will sell out. We're currently at about 650 registered participants. The room capacity there in Amsterdam is 800. So sometime in the coming days, we'll have to close registration. So if you do want to come, please be quick. And I'd like to thank both Phil and Feifei, Vanessa, for your time and look forward to meeting you again in Amsterdam next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing.
Thanks.